So in this video, I want to tackle the age-old question of Google versus Meta when it comes to your e-commerce business. So this has come through 13 years experience in the industry myself. I've worked with a couple of hundred brands plus to help them scale to multiple six figures, multiple seven figures through my paid community, the Ecom Blueprint. And I have an up-level mastermind program as well, where I work with about 5 people per year to help them scale to multiple seven figures. And so what I typically get asked, especially at that beginner stage, that early stage, is, Google versus Meta. What should I be running? How should I structure it? How much budget do I put in? There's a million different questions we can actually ask. And typically, this is what I respond with. Firstly, you need to know specifically where your audience is and what the intention of your product actually is and how people actually search for it. Okay, so what that specifically means, if we think in categories, and hopefully through this discussion, you can actually quantify it for yourself. When we talk about Meta, we talk about one main aspect, which is basically being able to reach millions of people within our target demographic and plant the seed of the idea that our product is appropriate for them. So that's what we would call a very cold audience, right? They've never seen us before. They're not aware of the solution. And, you can go through the various stages of problem aware, solution, all that sort of stuff. I won't go into that. But in terms of the bigger picture, to access people that ordinarily wouldn't know about us, that's where Meta performs its greatest function, reaching people for the very, very first time with the intention to obviously drive them to site, convert, etc. down the line. When it comes to Google, the intention there is that people have the problem and they're looking for the solution. So that's what we'd consider the warm audience. They know what they want or have some idea of what they want, at least the solution for their problem. And so they're actually searching in Google for a product like yours. That's where you pop up. And so the very first question that I ask people when they say, should I do Meta, should I do Google first, or should I do both at the same time? The first question I ask was, well, what category would your product fit into? Okay, now a misconception, a mistake that people make is they say both for a start, okay? And maybe there's some overlap, but there's going to be one that dominates the other. And the second thing is that they actually get it wrong, right? They actually think in this case, in this example, 9 times out of 10, when they make this mistake, they're saying, well, people do search for my product or my solution, when actually they don't, or a large majority of people actually don't. If we're selling baby wear or we're selling supplements or something like that, it's not as common that someone is going to search for you straight out of the gate. It's going to happen, of course. It's less common than someone actually getting the traction from someone seeing you for the first time and sparking curiosity. Okay, so in both aspects, we talk about, well, what are people searching for? Again, it's like solutions. It could be, we had a client recently who, sells hazard signs for work sites, for example, or even just, for your own home sort of thing. We have clients who basically sell tie downs on your roof racks and stuff like that. There's solution type products like that where there are high search volumes and Google ads can be the first port of call that people actually, gravitate to. Okay. So that's kind of the first thing I'd say about that is know exactly where the majority of people sit. If they're the problem aware looking for solutions, or they're not even really the problem aware and it becomes or even a desire aware. And that's what's on the other side of the fence where the cold audience is actually going to be most effective. So that's the first point, is know where, let's call it the majority of where people might be, even just as a hypothetical in the first instance. The second point is that you should only start with one at a time. Okay. One main reason behind this is so you can actually track things properly. The exact effectiveness, what the variable is. I changed this I basically launched my Meta ads or vice versa, Google ads, and this had this impact on my business. If you run both at once, you can't attribute the data or the effectiveness appropriately, right? Because one could be overlapping, one could drive this, one could drive that, there could be crossover. There's all sorts of confusion. So never do 2 at once. And this applies across the board for any marketing strategy, really. Never adopt 2 strategies at once because you don't know the proper effectiveness. So launch one, and then if you're curious, you can obviously launch the second one after a given amount of time, and you look at basically the net result of doing that secondary effort. So that's the other thing. The third thing is that there will inevitably be some overlap, and there will inevitably be some leverage, and so that has to be taken into consideration as well. Okay, so typically what we do say after you've launched your initial Google ads or your initial Meta ads, we would basically advise the next step is to say, okay, on the alternative platform, actually create some retargeting to make sure that when they go to one platform or the other, they actually do see your brand over and over and over again. Okay, so it's about recouping the money that was spent to drive the traffic there in the first place, and then be able to become profitable and retarget them on the back end. So for the example of Meta, right, we're getting traffic to site. We should already have retargeting going anyway. Okay, that's kind of hopefully doesn't have to be said, but we'd have a top of funnel, meaning our cold audience, and a bottom of funnel anyway. Advantage Plus can do that to some extent, but make sure we've got coverage there. And then from a Google perspective, we say, okay, let's create actually what we call like a catch can campaign, which basically means like a PMAX campaign that basically says if someone goes and searches for our brand or something similar, that we will actually pop up, especially if people search for our brand, because we don't want all the competitors popping up before us. And even if they search, the exact terms and stuff, ads will still come up above the organic ranking. So that's something we call the catch can. And that's a form of retargeting. And if it was the opposite case, if you're running Google ads, obviously you're driving traffic to site. That's where you need the retargeting going through Meta. So that across all the Meta's platforms and audience networks, people are actually seeing you as your product. Like, hey, come back. Hey, we saw you checking out this product. Hey, this is what we're about. Hey, this is the offer, etc., etc. So we do, as soon as possible, want to have coverage on both platforms. All right. And basically the other thing from that is too, they will complement each other. All right. So what happens is that people will literally go from Meta, they'll go to the site, then they'll go to Google and they'll go organic search you from desktop or, from some other device. Or if they go to Google, then they'll be on their phones and then they'll get retargeted on Meta and they'll go to your site and potentially purchase. So it's an ecosystem. As much as we would love e-commerce and the purchaser journey to be really linear, really predictable and consistent, it's just the reality, it isn't. All right. So when we're talking about running ads, we have to have really clear understanding of how it works, what the intention is, and also the circumvented nature of what we actually do and its intention. Okay. And that's when we talk through, blended metrics like blended ROAS and blended CPAs and all those sorts of things, which I've talked about, in other videos. So you can look at those if you need. But then the higher level thing too is also to understand what the metrics are telling us, because we typically find, now I'm not pro anything in terms of favoritism, but I typically see that Meta underreports, okay, from the hundreds of clients that we have worked with and do work with. I typically see that Meta underreports through a lack of tracking, a lot of that, but also just through delayed attribution and all sorts of other things. It can underreport by about 20 to 30%. That's a crazy amount when you think about it. So what I typically see then is that Google on the other side actually, I feel, overreports. All right. And that's because, not to be, deceptive by any means, but it's like maybe people are coming from socials, they're going to Google and searching, and then it's taking the credit. Maybe there's some other things going on in the background where Google is, taking credit or getting attributed where maybe it shouldn't be, or whatever. It doesn't necessarily matter, but the understanding has to be there. So I typically see from all the brands I've worked with and do work with that Meta underreports and Google overreports. Okay. The best way to understand by how much and if you should be changing budgets, because some people think, oh, Google's doing really well, take all out of Meta and put into Google and their whole sales tank because one was feeding the other. Right. So one way to actually know is to do that. Okay. I wouldn't recommend you do that. That's why we split test using the variables that I mentioned before. Go on 1 to X amount, go on 2 to X amount, and see the differences when you've got both running versus when you had the other one, just one, or obviously when you had none running prior to that. Right. So that's how we understand firstly what we go ahead and do first, and then the method of how we actually go and do it. And thirdly, how to read the metrics, which might seem like a bit of a crock pot of data that isn't actually easy to delineate as what we might think. Okay. Especially when you have other people, other sources, Google themselves, Meta themselves saying, look how good the results are. You need to know the source of truth under all of that and the efforts that you've done outside of that platform, which they don't know, rightfully so, what you've done to actually, prop up those results, because everything contributes and impacts on everything else in a very positive way. That's why we say when we send an email, our ads report will inflate, right? A good way. They've been hitting the right people, they've been seeing the right ads, and the email, got them to buy. So the holistic understanding of how marketing works is so crucial to having the confidence to then go ahead and grow and scale. Okay. So look, I hope this understanding was helpful for you, and this video entirely was helpful for you as well. If it was, I'd love a like, I'd love a subscribe. If you want to know more about how we help e-commerce business, you can click on the link below, have a chat if it seems like it might be worth having a discussion about. But other than that, I appreciate you watching till the end. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.